The uniform couldn't hide her scars. The weight of the uniform. The first time she put on the uniform, it felt heavier than she expected, not because of the fabric itself, thick wool that scratched against her skin, stiff boots that pinched her feet, a belt that pressed too tightly against her ribs, but because of what it symbolized. The uniform was supposed to erase individuality, to turn bodies into soldiers, to cover weakness with authority. But she knew, from the moment the fabric clung to her shoulders, that it could never erase what she carried beneath. The scars lived under the seams, invisible to others, but burning against her skin, as if the cloth itself remembered. The weight of the uniform was not the same for her as it was for the men. For them, it was pride, belonging, identity. For her, it was contradiction. She had fought to wear it, to be recognized as a soldier among soldiers, not just as a nurse, a helper, or a shadow. And yet, when it was finally hers, she realized it could never be only armor. It was also disguise, a costume meant to conceal the bruises, the cuts, the stories no one wanted to hear. It was meant to project strength, but beneath it, she felt the constant pulse of wounds that the world pretended did not exist. Every morning, when she buttoned the jacket, she felt her fingers hesitate over the scars that lined her body. Some were old, faded into pale traces, like rivers dried by time. Others were newer, raw and red, evidence of battles not fought with weapons, but with survival itself. She had been told more than once that she should hide them, that scars were marks of imperfection, reminders of weakness. But she knew better. Each one was a map of endurance, carved into her skin by circumstances that had demanded more of her than the war itself. The uniform pressed against those scars like a constant reminder. When she marched, the fabric rubbed against her skin until the old wounds burned again. When she saluted, her sleeve brushed over a line carved deep into her arm years before. The men around her never noticed. To them, she was another soldier, another figure in the formation. But she carried a truth they would never feel. The uniform could not hide pain. It could only cover it in plain sight, pretending it had vanished while it lived beneath, restless and alive. Sometimes she looked at her reflection in the mirror after long days, the uniform still on her body, sweat and dust clinging to its surface. The woman staring back at her looked like a soldier. Sharp posture, straight shoulders, chin raised. But when she removed the jacket, when the boots came off, when the layers fell away, the truth emerged. Scars along her ribs, across her thighs, down her back. A body not shaped by glory, but by survival. A body that told a story no medal could honor. She often wondered if anyone would ever see her scars and understand what they meant, instead of mocking them, dismissing them, or turning away. The weight of the uniform came not only from fabric and memory, but also from silence. She could not speak of where some scars had come from, not the ones inflicted by violence inside the barracks, not the ones left by nights when she was more prisoner than soldier. Those scars belonged to stories too heavy for words, stories that the uniform demanded she bury. To speak them aloud would be to break the illusion of strength. And so she carried them in silence, letting the fabric hold what her voice could not release. Yet beneath all that, the uniform carried something else. It carried defiance to put it on each morning, despite the pain, despite the weight, despite the contradiction, was to declare, I am still here. I am not erased. I am not broken. The scars made the uniform heavier, but they also made it more meaningful. She wore it not because it erased her wounds, but because it proved she could stand despite them. In the barracks, other women knew. They too wore uniforms that could not hide what lived beneath. They caught each other's eyes in the quiet moments, when the men had gone, when only silence remained. Their glances said what words could not. I see you. I know. I carry it too. In those glances, the weight of the uniform grew lighter, if only for a moment, because to be recognized was to be freed, even briefly, from the lie that scars must remain invisible. At night, when she lay down, still in uniform because there was no safety in vulnerability, she would trace her scars with her fingers. Sometimes she hated them, wishing her skin could return to the way it once was, unbroken, unmarked. Other times, she felt pride because each scar was proof that she had survived what others had not. They were not weaknesses, but victories, though quiet, though unseen. The uniform hid them from the world, but it could never make her forget. The weight of the uniform was a paradox she carried every day. It was armor and mask, shield and burden, pride and pain. It gave her authority, but it also silenced her truth. It covered her scars, but in covering them, it made them ache more deeply. And yet, she kept wearing it, because in the end, the scars and the uniform were not enemies. They were parts of the same story. They declared together that strength is not the absence of wounds, but the decision to carry them forward anyway. Beneath the fabric was a truth no command, no anthem, no uniform could erase. Every seam pressed against a story that her body remembered even when her voice refused to tell it. The fabric was thick, stiff, woven for battle, but it was never thick enough to silence the skin beneath. Beneath it lived the marks of knights that had carved into her ribs, the faint ridges of blades, the burns left by fire, the bruises pressed by hands that should never have touched her. Beneath the fabric lived her scars, quiet, raw, and unashamed, though the world wanted them hidden. When others looked at her, they saw the uniform first. They saw its clean lines, its sharp silhouette, its authority. To them, she was a soldier, no different from the rest. They saluted, they gave orders, they received them in turn. But when she removed it, when she stood before herself, she saw a body that did not match the illusion. She saw how war had written its history across her skin, how every scar was a sentence, every mark a testimony. Her body was not only hers anymore, it was an archive. Some nights she wished the fabric could do what people expected it to, erase the past. She wanted to believe in its power, in its promise to transform her into someone untouched, someone whole. But fabric was only fabric. It could cover, but it could not heal. It could conceal, but it could not undo. Beneath it, the scars pulsed as if reminding her that forgetting was not an option. There were moments when she envied the men. Their scars were worn as medals, proof of battles fought, symbols of courage. They lifted sleeves to show them off, unbuttoned collars to reveal them, spoke of them with pride. But her scars were not the kind the world wanted to see. They were reminders of things no one wanted to acknowledge. Violations, humiliations, survival in silence. To reveal them would not bring respect, but shame, pity, or worse, mockery. And so she let the fabric cover them, while knowing it did not erase them. Yet beneath the fabric was not only pain, there was resilience too. Each scar was a story not of ending, but of continuation. Each mark was proof that she had lived through what should have destroyed her. The world saw scars as flaws, but she had begun to see them as resistance. If her body carried the evidence of survival, then it carried also the strength of it. Beneath the fabric was not only brokenness, it was persistence. When she walked, the uniform announced discipline, but her skin whispered defiance. When she marched, the boots struck rhythm, but her scars carried memory. When she saluted, her hand was steady, but her body trembled with the weight of what lay beneath. This duality became her existence, soldier on the outside, survivor beneath. And though the two seemed contradictory, together they made her whole. She remembered one evening when she undressed slowly, the barrack empty except for her. She looked at her body in the dim light and touched each scar with her fingertips. Some were thin lines, almost invisible. Others were deep, ridged, impossible to miss. She traced them as if reading Braille, as if her skin was a book written in pain and endurance. For the first time, she whispered to herself, "You are still here." They did not win. In that moment, beneath the fabric, she found strength instead of shame. There were other women like her, though no one spoke of it openly. In quiet moments, she saw them adjusting their uniforms, pulling collars higher, sleeves lower, belts tighter. She knew what they were hiding, even if they never said. Beneath every fabric was another story, another body marked by survival. They all carried archives the world would never read, chapters stitched into flesh. They all lived with the contradiction. The uniform demanded sameness, but beneath it, every scar made them different. And yet, there was solidarity in that silence. When their eyes met, she felt a recognition deeper than words. They saw past the fabric into what lay beneath. They saw the scars and did not flinch. They did not ask questions, did not judge, did not pity. They simply knew. And in that knowing, the scars became lighter, not because they vanished, but because they were shared. The uniform could not hide her scars, and perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps the fabric was only a veil, a temporary mask. The truth was that beneath it, her scars had already begun to speak. They spoke in her resilience, in her defiance, in her decision to keep wearing the uniform despite what it could not conceal. They spoke in the quiet strength of her posture, in the fire that burned in her eyes when others underestimated her. Beneath the fabric was pain, yes, but also a power the world could never strip away. She understood then that her scars were not enemies. They were witnesses. They remembered what she wished she could forget, but they also testified to the fact that she had endured. And though the uniform pressed against them, tried to cover them, could never erase them, she realized that maybe she did not want them erased. Maybe her scars were not something to hide, but something to carry. Not as shame, but as truth. Beneath the fabric, she was not only a soldier, she was a survivor. And no uniform, no silence, no scar could change that. The first scar. The first scar never leaves you, no matter how many come after. It is not just a mark on skin. It is the moment the body learns that it is vulnerable. The soul learns that it can be broken, and the heart learns that pain has memory. For her, the first scar was not a clean line, not a wound from battle fought on open fields, but a sudden rupture that carried with it both shock and shame. It was the scar that made all others possible, the one that changed her forever. She still remembered the night when it happened, though the memory blurred at its edges. War had already consumed her life, but until then she still carried within her the fragile illusion that she was untouched, that she was whole. Then came the moment when cruelty tore into her, leaving behind not only blood, but silence. That silence lasted longer than the pain itself. It was the silence of not being believed, of not being allowed to speak, of realizing that some wounds are not supposed to exist in the eyes of others. The first scar was small compared to those that followed, but its weight was heavier than all the rest. It was not just flesh, it was identity. It changed the way she looked at her own reflection, the way she carried herself, the way she walked into a room. She began to see her body not as her own, but as something that had been claimed, marked, altered. From that day, her body was no longer a safe place, it was a battlefield. She covered the wound as best she could, binding it with cloth torn from what little she had. No doctor came, no medic offered care. She healed in silence, alone, and as the flesh closed, the scar rose, a thin, pale line that seemed almost insignificant to the eye, but inside it burned with meaning. To her it was the end of innocence. It was the line that divided her life into before and after. The first scar taught her to hide. It taught her to pull sleeves lower, to button collars higher, to step into shadows when others looked too closely. It taught her that not every wound would be honored, that some scars would be dismissed or mocked. It taught her that silence was sometimes safer than truth, and so she carried it beneath the fabric even long before the uniform became hers. But the first scar also taught her something else: endurance. She learned that pain could be survived even when it felt impossible. She learned that blood dries, that wounds close, that the body remembers but also continues. The scar was both betrayal and promise. Betrayal of her innocence, but promise that she could survive worse than she imagined. Without knowing it, she had already become a soldier long before the war allowed her a uniform. Years later, when she looked at herself in the mirror, surrounded by dozens of scars, she could still find that first one. It had faded to a faint line, almost invisible. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, a scratch, a mistake of skin. But to her, it was the root of all the others. It was the moment she stopped being untouched. It was the mark that whispered to her, "You will never be the same, but you will survive anyway." In conversations with the other women, though words were rare, she sometimes caught glimpses of their first scars too. Each had one. A mark on a cheek, a faint line across a wrist, a bruise that had never healed right. They carried them quietly like hidden relics. But the truth was always there. The first scar was the doorway to the story no one wanted to tell. And though no one spoke of it, their silences touched, forming a bond stronger than words. The uniform pressed against her scars, but it could never erase the first one. It lived deeper than fabric, deeper than skin. It was stitched into memory itself. And though she sometimes wished she could remove it, erase it, wake up as though it had never happened, she also knew it was part of her now. It was not just a wound, it was survival written in flesh. The first scar was not the last, but it was the one that taught her what scars meant. They were not just marks of pain, they were stories, reminders, proof. They were maps of what she had endured, testaments that she was still alive. And so, though she carried many scars, she always returned to the first, tracing it with her fingers when the nights grew long, remembering not only the pain, but the survival that followed. Because in the end, the first scar was not the beginning of her end, it was the beginning of her strength. Courage sewn into seams. The uniform was never just fabric. It was stitched with expectations, demands, illusions of strength. For her, it became more than that. It became a second skin, one that tried to cover what lay beneath, but also carried its own story. She often thought that the seams themselves held courage, as if every stitch had been made to keep her upright, to keep her walking forward when her body wanted to collapse. The uniform could not erase her scars, but it could remind her each day that she had chosen to stand despite them. Every morning, when she dressed, the act was ritual. She slid her arms into sleeves that scratched against skin already raw. She buttoned each button carefully, as though fastening herself back into existence. She tied the belt around her waist, pulling it tighter than necessary, not to look proper, but to feel the pressure against her ribs, a reminder that she was contained, controlled, alive. It was a daily act of courage, not because the world would see her as brave, but because she refused to let the scars stop her. The seams carried stories. The thread that bound her collar together pressed against her neck, where a scar curved like a question mark. The cuffs brushed against her wrists, hiding faint white lines she traced only in private. The trousers rubbed against marks on her thighs, lines carved there not by choice, but by cruelty. Each seam lay directly across a scar, as if stitching her back together, holding her in place. The fabric could not heal, but it could cover just enough for her to keep moving. Sometimes, when she looked at other women in the barracks, she noticed the same thing. Each of them had uniforms that fit awkwardly, too loose or too tight, hiding bodies that had been reshaped by pain. She wondered if they too felt the seams like she did, if they too believed the thread carried something more than function. She believed that every uniform sewn for women carried not only fabric but defiance, that the act of putting it on each day was itself courage stitched into cloth. The men often joked about uniforms, how hot they were in summer, how heavy in winter, how they longed for the comfort of civilian clothes. She listened, but never joined in. For her, the uniform was not discomfort. It was shield. It was mask. It was the one thing that allowed her to walk among them without her scars being immediately visible. They would never know what it meant for her to have something strong to wrap around her weakness, something that gave her a chance to look like she belonged. And yet, she also knew the uniform was fragile. It could tear, a sleeve could slip, a button could loosen, and suddenly her scars could be seen. The thought terrified her. Exposure meant questions she did not want to answer, judgments she could not bear, so she kept her uniform meticulously clean, perfectly fitted, always in place. She wore it as armor, but also as a promise to herself. No one would see what she carried beneath, not unless she chose. There was one night when the seam of her uniform ripped, a long tear across her sleeve during a skirmish. The men laughed, teasing her for being careless, but beneath the torn fabric, her scar glowed in the firelight, a jagged line across her arm, unmistakable. For a moment the world froze, the laughter faltered. They looked at her differently, not with admiration for bravery, but with unease, as though the scar revealed too much. She pulled the fabric back over quickly, stitching it later by hand with thread stolen from a kit. As she worked, she whispered to herself, "Courage is not in what they see. Courage is in what I continue to carry." That moment taught her something. The seams of her uniform were not only physical, they were symbolic. They held her together even when others tried to unravel her. Every scar beneath was a reminder of pain, but every stitch above was a declaration of strength. Together, they made her whole, not unbroken, but unyielding. She began to imagine that her courage was literally sewn into the seams. Each button fastened was a choice to endure. Each belt tightened was a vow to persist. Each repair she made by hand, patching holes, fixing tears, was proof that survival was ongoing work, not a finished act. She carried her courage not in medals or speeches, but in the quiet way she dressed herself each day. Other women noticed. Once another soldier touched the shoulder of her uniform and said softly, "You wear it differently than they do." She did not explain why, but she knew what the woman meant. To her, the uniform was not just clothing. It was survival stitched into fabric. It was the visible sign of invisible battles. It was the one thing that allowed her to walk into the day and face it again, even when her body remembered too much of the night. Courage, she realized, was not loud. It was not the shout of commands or the thunder of boots. It was in the quiet act of covering scars each morning, of tightening seams over wounds, of carrying pain beneath fabric and still moving forward. Courage was in the decision to live with contradictions, to wear strength over weakness, silence over screams, fabric over scars. And so each day she dressed. She wore her courage not on her chest, not in medals, but in the seams that held her together. The uniform could not hide her scars, but it could remind her that scars were not the end of her story. They were the beginning. Whispers in the barracks. The barracks smelled of sweat, iron, and damp wood. Rows of beds stood in tight formation, each occupied by women who wore the same uniform, the same boots, the same expression of exhaustion. By day they marched, obeyed, saluted. By night they returned here, to the one place where silence fell heavy and words, when spoken, were spoken in whispers. For it was in the barracks that truth dared to rise, not in shouts, not in speeches, but in the fragile murmur of women whose scars could no longer be contained by fabric alone. She lay on her bunk, staring at the beams above her, listening. Around her, the whispers began like small rivers weaving through stillness. One voice hummed softly, a song from a village that no longer existed. Another murmured a prayer, words spilling not for God to hear, but for herself, to anchor her through the night. Sometimes the whispers were conversations, broken sentences passed from bed to bed, carried in tones so faint that the guards beyond the door would never notice. It was through these whispers that she first learned she was not alone. She had carried her scars in silence, convinced they were hers alone to bear. But in the barracks, she began to hear fragments that mirrored her own story. A woman spoke of burns hidden under her collar. Another confessed to bruises she painted over with mud. Another laughed bitterly and said, "We are stitched together with secrets." Each whisper was both a confession and a lifeline, proof that no one carried the weight in isolation. The men never knew. To them, the barracks were simply quarters, nothing more. But for the women, they were sacred spaces, fragile sanctuaries where truth could slip through cracks in discipline. Here, uniformity cracked open to reveal individuality. Here, silence bent just enough to let whispers live. The whispers were not always about pain. Sometimes they were about memory. A woman described her mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, the warmth of fire. Another spoke of fields where she had once run barefoot, her voice trembling as she remembered the texture of grass. These fragments of ordinary life became extraordinary within the barracks. They reminded the women of who they had been, of who they still were beneath fabric and scars. They reminded them that war had not erased everything. And sometimes the whispers carried humor, dry, sharp, defiant. A woman joked about how ridiculous the boots looked, too large for feet that were meant to dance. Another teased that medals should be given not for victories, but for surviving hunger. Laughter, soft and cautious, filled the space for a moment, fragile but real. That laughter was rebellion. It said, "You have not broken us yet." She began to whisper too, at first reluctantly, then with more trust. One night, when the barracks was cloaked in stillness, she admitted in a voice barely audible, "My scars ache more at night." Another woman across the room whispered back, "Mine too." That was all, nothing more. But in that simple exchange, the weight lifted. Two voices connected, two scars acknowledged, two silences broken. It was enough. The barracks became a place of invisible threads, spun not of fabric but of words. Whispers wove the women together, binding them in ways uniforms never could. They carried each other's secrets, holding them as carefully as they held their own. They never repeated them aloud, never let them slip into daylight, but in the night they shared enough to keep breathing. There was power in whispers. They could not topple regimes or stop armies, but they could keep women alive. They could remind them that their scars were not shame, but survival. They could transform silence into solidarity, pain into recognition. In the barracks, through whispers, women became each other's witnesses, and in a world that wanted them invisible, to be witnessed was everything. She learned that her scars were not only hers. They belonged to a collective story, one whispered across beds, across nights, across lives. Each woman carried her own, yet all were connected. The barracks was not just a place of sleep, it was a place of truth, hidden beneath the surface of obedience, carried in voices that dared to break silence without breaking discipline. And in that fragile sanctuary, among whispers and shadows, she found something she had thought lost forever: belonging. Scars they laughed at. The first time they laughed at her scars, it felt colder than the sharpest winter wind. She had expected silence, or perhaps pity, but not laughter. Yet war had a way of twisting even suffering into mockery, as if by ridiculing wounds others could shield themselves from the truth of their own fragility. They mocked what they could not bear to face. And her scars became an easy target. It happened in the yard, during training. The day was hot, and sweat drenched their uniforms. When the order came to roll up their sleeves, she hesitated. Beneath the fabric lay scars that never healed into invisibility. They were jagged, uneven reminders of nights that could not be spoken of. She pulled her sleeve higher anyway, because to disobey was worse than exposure. And then it came, the glances first, sharp and darting, then the smirks, then the sound of laughter. Not all laughed, but enough to cut her to the bone. "Looks like someone lost a fight with their own shadow," one muttered. Another chuckled. "Or maybe she carries her battlefield on her skin." Their voices carried no understanding, only cruelty. They turned scars into jokes, into objects of amusement, stripping them of their true meaning. What for her were lines carved by survival, for them became punchlines to break tension. She stood motionless, her arms exposed, her scars glowing raw under the sun. She wanted to scream, to tell them what those marks meant, to make them choke on their laughter. But she remained silent, jaw clenched, body steady. To answer would have been to let them win twice, first in their cruelty, then in her surrender. So she endured as she always had, carrying the laughter like another scar. That night in the barracks, the whispers soothed her. Another woman touched her arm gently, tracing one of the scars without judgment, only recognition. "They don't know," she whispered. "They couldn't bear it if they did." The others nodded in silence. None of them laughed. They knew what scars meant. They knew that every line was a survival, not a failure. In that small circle of understanding, the mockery lost some of its sting, but the memory of laughter stayed with her. It was worse than pain, worse than silence, worse than disbelief. Pain acknowledged you, silence left you alone. But laughter erased you entirely, turning your truth into entertainment. It robbed scars of dignity and left behind shame. It made survival feel like a joke in the eyes of those who had never endured the same. She thought often about why they laughed. Perhaps because it was easier to laugh than to face the reality that the war had not spared anyone, not even their own comrades. Perhaps because laughter was a weapon of denial, a way to pretend that her scars were choices, not violence. Or perhaps simply because cruelty breeds cruelty, and those who could not control the enemy sought instead to wound their own. Whatever the reason, it revealed one truth: scars unsettled people. They forced the world to look at pain it would rather ignore. Yet even as they laughed, the scars refused to be diminished. They carried their own power, one the mockery could never erase. Each time she looked at them, she remembered, not the laughter, but the survival. She remembered nights when she thought she would not live to see dawn, days when hunger hollowed her body, hours when cruelty pressed against her skin. And yet here she was, alive, breathing, standing. The scars were not weaknesses. They were monuments of endurance. One evening, as the women prepared for rest, she spoke softly to them. They laughed today. The others grew quiet, waiting. She raised her sleeve, showing the marks that had been mocked. But these are not for them to laugh at. They are mine. They are my story. They will never understand. Another woman answered, "Let them laugh. Every scar they mock is proof you outlived what would have killed them." The whispers carried agreement. Together they reclaimed dignity through solidarity. Years later, when the war ended and uniforms were folded away, the scars remained. Sometimes strangers still noticed them. Sometimes whispers still turned to ridicule. But she no longer bowed beneath the weight of laughter. She had learned in the barracks, among whispers, that scars laughed at are scars feared, scars misunderstood, scars envied for their truth. And truth, no matter how ridiculed, does not vanish. Her scars were laughed at, but they endured, and in enduring, they silenced the laughter more completely than words ever could. The medal that burned against her skin, the day she received the medal, was supposed to be a day of honor. Soldiers stood in rigid lines, boots aligned, uniforms pressed, faces lifted toward the general who spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and glory. Flags waved in the wind, the sound of drums rolled across the yard, and names were called one by one. When her name echoed through the air, a hush fell for an instant, surprised that a woman's name was spoken among the men. Then applause rose, filling the silence with a sound that felt hollow to her ears. She stepped forward, steady, shoulders squared, the uniform clinging tightly as if it too anticipated the weight about to be pinned upon it. The general placed the medal against her chest, fastening it over her heart. The metal was cold at first, sharp against her skin, pressing through the fabric with a weight far greater than its size. She saluted, eyes forward, her face unreadable. The crowd cheered, but inside her chest burned, not with pride, but with fire. The medal was supposed to symbolize courage, but to her it felt like mockery. It pressed against the very scars the uniform tried to hide, scars that no one wanted to acknowledge. The same comrades who had once laughed at her wounds now applauded her for bravery they would never understand. The medal did not honor her scars. It ignored them, pretending that her pain had been part of some noble plan instead of raw survival. That night, when the barracks were quiet, she unpinned the medal and held it in her hand. The metal gleamed in the dim light, its surface smooth, its edges sharp. She traced it with her fingers and felt anger rise. This was what they gave her in exchange for everything she had endured, a piece of metal, cold and indifferent, to cover the wounds that burned beneath. She pressed it against her skin, directly over a scar, and winced at the heat it seemed to generate. The medal burned not because of its temperature, but because of its lie. Some of the other women gathered around her curious. One of them whispered, "Does it feel heavy?" She nodded but did not answer fully. How could she explain that the medal weighed more than her scars? Not because it recognized them, but because it erased them. How could she say that it felt like another wound, a polished one, a wound decorated instead of healed? For the men, medals were treasures. They wore them proudly, displayed them on their chests, spoke of them as if they were proof of immortality. For her, the medal was a mask. It glittered where her scars should have spoken. It shouted honor where silence should have been allowed. It burned because it did not belong, not to her, not to her story, not to the truth of what she had endured. She thought of tearing it from her uniform and throwing it into the fire. She imagined watching it melt, the metal collapsing into itself, unmade as easily as it had been given. But she did not. Instead, she placed it carefully in her pocket, carrying it like another scar, unwanted but impossible to discard. The medal became part of her story, not because it honored her, but because it revealed the distance between how the world saw her and who she truly was. She thought of tearing it from her uniform and throwing it into the fire. She imagined watching it melt, the metal collapsing into itself, unmade as easily as it had been given. But she did not. Instead, she placed it carefully in her pocket, carrying it like another scar, unwanted but impossible to discard. The medal became part of her story, not because it honored her, but because it revealed the distance between how the world saw her and who she truly was. In time, she wore the medal only when ordered. On her chest, it gleamed for others to see, reflecting sunlight, catching eyes. But she knew it was false light, a shine that did not come from her, but from metal pinned to her body. Underneath, her scars pulsed with their own fire, invisible but truer than any decoration. The contrast between the two, the medal that lied and the scars that spoke, became unbearable at times. Yet she also understood something important. The medal could never silence her scars. It could cover them, weigh upon them, burn against them, but it could not erase them. When she touched her skin beneath the metal, she felt the ridges, the lines, the proof of her survival. The medal was theirs, the scars were hers, and hers carried a truth no ceremony could rewrite. One evening, in the stillness of the barracks, she whispered to the others, "This medal burns. It burns because it pretends to be heavier than what we already carry." Another woman nodded, pulling her own decoration from a drawer. "Mine too. It shines for them, but for me, It is just another silence. Together they laughed softly, not cruel laughter like the men had given, but bitter, knowing laughter. They laughed because they understood that medals could decorate uniforms, but they could not decorate pain. Years later, when the war was over and the uniforms folded away, the medal remained. It sat in a box, tarnished, untouched. She rarely looked at it, but when she did, she felt the echo of its burn. And each time she felt it, she reminded herself of the truth. No piece of metal could define her. No decoration could measure her scars. She was not the medal. She was the body beneath it, the survivor it tried to conceal. The medal that burned against her skin did not mark her courage. It revealed how misunderstood courage truly was. True courage was not in standing before a crowd with polished metal on her chest. True courage was in standing at all, with scars beneath the fabric, unseen yet undefeated. Her body is a battlefield. Long before she ever stood on open ground with a weapon in her hands, her body had already been a battlefield. It was not chosen terrain, not volunteered soil, but taken, invaded, fought upon, scarred. Generals might have pointed to maps, soldiers might have stormed across borders, but her own skin bore campaigns no map could contain. The war had raged not only in fields and cities, but in the silence of her own flesh. She learned too soon that the body could become a territory for conquest. It began with hands that did not ask, with power that did not need permission. Violence left her ribs aching, her breath shallow, her spirit fractured. But when it was over, the body remained, trembling yet alive. She carried the weight of it in her bones, in the marks carved into her, in the invisible bruises that lingered longer than any physical wound. The war had taken ground, but she still stood. The cruelest truth was that the body never fully healed from such invasions. Scars closed, bruises faded, but memory lived beneath the surface. Every uniform she wore pressed against that memory, every button fastened over a chest that remembered. Her body was both fortress and ruin, shield and wound. It carried contradiction with every step. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she sometimes felt like two people. The soldier, dressed in uniform, disciplined, unyielding, and the battlefield, uncovered, scarred, vulnerable. Both existed at once, never fully reconciling, never fully separate. She wondered if others could feel the war etched into her body when they looked at her, or if the uniform truly disguised it. Yet she knew that disguise was only surface. Beneath, the war continued. Her body became the place where silence settled most heavily. She rarely spoke of what had been done, not because she had forgotten, but because the language to name it did not exist. Words failed, but her body never lied. It remembered in sleepless nights, in flinches she could not control, in scars that whispered each time she touched them. Others might deny the battle she had endured, but her body carried testimony no denial could erase. There were moments when she hated it, hated the scars, hated the way her body betrayed her, hated that it had been chosen as someone else's battleground. She longed for escape from her own skin, to shed it like the uniform at the end of the day, to walk away from it entirely. But she could not. She lived within it day after day, night after night, learning to make peace with terrain she had never chosen. And yet slowly she began to see her body differently. It was not only a battlefield, it was also a survivor. It bore the marks, yes, but it bore them while still moving, still breathing, still living. It was not destroyed. It was scarred, but it remained. To carry scars meant that she had carried herself beyond the violence, that she had refused to vanish even when others tried to erase her. Her body was not conquered ground. It was liberated ground. In the barracks, when whispers passed between women, she realized she was not the only one. Every woman there carried a battlefield beneath her uniform. Each bore scars of her own, visible or invisible, remembered or suppressed. Together, they were an army not of soldiers but of survivors, women whose bodies had been attacked yet remained standing. They never spoke of it openly, but in their eyes she saw the same truth. We have all been battlegrounds, and yet we remain alive. She began to walk with a new kind of defiance. Each step was no longer just duty, but declaration. Each movement of her scarred body was resistance against the forces that had tried to break it. When she saluted, she did not do it for generals or medals. She did it for herself, for the body that had endured, for the battlefield that had not fallen. In time, she came to believe that the scars themselves were not weaknesses but banners. They were proof that her body was not empty land to be taken, but sacred ground that had survived violation. To touch them was to touch history. To reveal them, even in whispers, was to reclaim what had been taken. She carried them not as trophies, but as truth. Her body had been a battlefield, yes, but it had also been a sanctuary for endurance, a vessel of survival, a witness to life continuing even when everything else ended. And though the uniform pressed against her scars, it could never silence them. They spoke through her posture, through her resilience, through the quiet fire in her eyes. Her body was not ruined ground, it was living ground. And every scar upon it was proof that even battlefields can grow flowers after the war. The nights without bandages. The nights were the hardest. During the day, the noise of orders, the rhythm of boots, the demands of survival kept her moving forward, carrying her pain like a secret under her uniform. But when the darkness fell and silence settled in the barracks, there was no distraction strong enough to hide the ache. Nights stripped away the illusion of strength. They left her with nothing but her body, her scars, and the throbbing reminder that not every wound could be closed, not every hurt could be healed. There were no bandages in those nights, no clean strips of cloth to wrap around open skin, no medicine to dull the sting, no hands trained to stitch wounds with care. There was only improvisation. Torn fabric from worn uniforms became makeshift dressings. Ash or mud was pressed into cuts to stop the bleeding, though it often caused infection instead. Scarves were tied tightly around arms and legs, not to heal, but to hold broken pieces together until morning. Every act of tending was survival, not recovery. She remembered one night when the pain in her ribs grew unbearable. The scar there, torn open by movement during the day, burned with every breath. She lay on her bunk, trying not to cry out, because sound invited attention, and attention brought danger. Beside her, another woman noticed her trembling. Without a word, she slipped off her own jacket, tore a piece from its lining, and pressed it against the wound. It was not sterile, not safe, not enough, but it was something, and in that moment something was everything. The barracks became a place of silent caretaking. Women looked after one another with what little they had, using whispers and gestures instead of instructions. They shared scraps of cloth, traded the tiniest fragments of soap, offered the warmth of their bodies when fevers rose. They became each other's bandages, each other's medicine, each other's healing. No one expected miracles. The goal was not to erase the wounds, but to endure them long enough to survive another day. But there were nights when even endurance felt impossible. Nights when fever consumed bodies, when the stench of infection filled the air, when silence grew heavy because one voice had gone quiet forever. On those nights, the absence of bandages was unbearable. She would sit in the dark, clutching her scars, wishing for hands that could heal, for ointments that did not exist, for the smallest mercy of clean water. Instead, she had only her breath, her will, and the determination not to let the wound take more from her than it already had. Pain changed during those nights. It became a language of its own, spoken through the body when words failed. Every scar pulsed with memory, every cut told a story. She learned to measure time, not in hours, but in heartbeats, each one proof that she was still alive. She learned to listen to her scars, to know when they demanded rest, when they could be pushed further, when they were warning her of limits she dared not cross. Her scars became teachers in survival, even as they remained reminders of what she had endured. She also learned that the absence of bandages revealed something deeper, that healing was not only physical. Even without cloth, without medicine, without care, the body found ways to close. Flesh sealed itself in jagged lines, imperfect but strong. Pain lessened, never gone, but quieter. The body carried on, even when neglected. It was resilience written in skin, endurance written in scars. She came to see her body not as broken, but as resourceful. Each scar was proof that even without care, she had found a way to continue. In the whispers of the barracks, women sometimes spoke of bandages as dreams. "When the war is over," one said, "I will wrap my children in clean cloth every day, so they will never know this." Another said, "I dream of doctors who do not laugh at us, who do not turn away." They spoke of healing as though it were a luxury, a paradise waiting beyond the gates. For them, bandages became symbols of dignity, of humanity restored. To have wounds tended was not just medicine, it was recognition that they mattered. When she closed her eyes in those nights, she often imagined hands, gentle hands, careful hands, that would one day touch her scars without judgment. She imagined bandages clean and white, wrapped around her with tenderness instead of haste. She imagined pain finally allowed to rest, finally acknowledged, finally soothed. Those dreams kept her alive as much as any scrap of food. They reminded her that the absence of bandages now did not mean the absence of healing forever. Years later, long after the war, when she finally had access to real bandages, she held them with reverence. Simple rolls of cloth, sterile and clean, felt like treasures. She wrapped them around her children's knees when they fell, around her own hands when they cracked. Every time she touched a bandage, she remembered the nights when she had none. The memory made her careful, tender, grateful. Healing had once been impossible. Now it was within reach, and she never forgot the difference. The nights without bandages shaped her as deeply as any scar. They taught her that survival does not always come with comfort, that healing can begin even in absence, that the body remembers pain, but also remembers how to endure it. They taught her that care, when it came, was sacred, and they taught her that scars, though born in neglect, could still carry beauty in survival. The uniform could not hide her scars, but neither could the absence of bandages erase her will. She endured those nights without care, without healing, without help. And yet she emerged, scarred but alive, carrying with her the truth that even in the absence of everything, the will to live can be stronger than the wounds that threaten it. The mirror that refused to lie. She avoided mirrors whenever she could. In the army camps, in the barracks, in the ruins of homes where shards of glass still clung to broken walls, she turned her face away. The mirror was not her friend. It was an enemy more honest than any soldier, more ruthless than any commander. The mirror had no interest in medals, no loyalty to uniforms, no reverence for discipline. The mirror told the truth, and the truth was something she could only bear in small doses. When she stood before one, stripped of her jacket and boots, the reflections stared back like an accusation. The scars were there, visible in the dim light, etched across her chest, her arms, her thighs. They traced her body like maps, lines pointing to moments she wished she could forget. Some were pale and thin, almost blending into her skin. Others were thick and dark, raised like ridges on a battlefield. Each one had its story, though she rarely allowed herself to remember. The mirror refused to let her pretend. The uniform could create the illusion of wholeness. Buttoned tightly, seams straight, shoulders squared, she looked like a soldier. But in the mirror, with fabric gone, she was a woman made of fragments, a patchwork of survival stitched into flesh. She wanted to look away, but the mirror forced her to see. At first she hated it. She hated the way her reflection reminded her of everything she had lost. The body she once knew, the one that danced, that ran, that carried the softness of youth, was gone. In its place stood a survivor, harder, scarred, older than her years. She hated that she could no longer recognize herself, that war had taken even her own image from her. The mirror made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. But slowly, reluctantly, she began to notice something else. The scars, though brutal, also told a story of defiance. They were not pretty, but they were honest. They spoke of wounds endured, of nights survived, of mornings where she rose again, despite everything. They reminded her that she was still here, still breathing, still moving. The mirror showed her pain, yes, but it also showed her proof. Proof that she had not been erased. She remembered one night in particular. The barracks were quiet, the others asleep, and a shard of broken glass leaned against the wall near her bed. She picked it up, holding it carefully, and looked into it. At first, she saw only the scars. Her throat tightened, her stomach turned, shame rising like bile. But then she forced herself to keep looking. She traced the lines with her eyes, then with her fingers. Slowly, she whispered, "These are mine. They belong to me, not to them." The words felt strange, as though borrowed but powerful. For years, she had seen her scars as proof of violation, proof of cruelty, proof of loss. But in that moment, looking into the shard, she began to claim them as her own. They were not marks of weakness. They were evidence of her survival. They did not belong to the men who had caused them. They belonged to her, carved into her body as a record of her endurance. The mirror did not soften after that. It still showed the truth, still reflected scars without pity. But now, when she looked, she no longer saw only brokenness. She saw resilience. She saw a body that had suffered and still stood. She saw a woman who had faced what others could not imagine and had not vanished. The scars remained, but the shame began to shift. Of course, not every day carried this strength. There were still mornings when the sight of her reflection filled her with disgust, when she covered herself quickly, when she wished she could shatter every mirror into dust. Healing was not a straight line. It was a circle, a spiral, a winding path between despair and acceptance. But each time she faced the mirror and whispered ownership of her scars, the balance shifted a little more towards strength. The women in the barracks shared similar struggles. One confessed in whispers that she avoided the small mirror hidden in her bag. Another admitted she broke hers in anger, unable to bear its honesty. Together, they spoke of mirrors as enemies, but also as teachers. The mirror revealed what the uniform denied. It forced them to confront the truth of their bodies, and in time, some began to see what she had begun to see, that survival, no matter how scarred, carried its own kind of beauty. Years later, when peace came and uniforms were folded away, she still struggled with mirrors. In her home, she kept them small, discreet. But sometimes, when she felt strong, she stood before them without fear. She looked at her scars in daylight, not hiding, not turning away. And though tears still came, so did something else: pride. The mirror that refused to lie had once been her enemy. It had forced her to see what she wanted to deny. But in refusing to lie, it had also given her the gift of truth. It showed her that she was scarred, yes, but it also showed her that she was still here, and in the end, that was the most important truth of all. When brothers in arms looked away, the phrase "brothers in arms" was supposed to mean loyalty. It was supposed to mean that those who fought side by side would protect one another, that no one would be abandoned, that solidarity was stronger than fear. For her, though, the phrase rang hollow. She had fought beside them, bled beside them, carried their weight when they stumbled. Yet when it came to her truth, her scars, her suffering, they looked away. It was not always deliberate cruelty. Sometimes it was avoidance. When her sleeve slipped and a scar showed, eyes darted elsewhere, Conversations shifted, silence pressed in. They looked at the ground, at the sky, at anything but her. It was as if acknowledging her wounds would make them real, would force them to admit that the war had left marks not just on the battlefield, but on the bodies of their comrades. And so they pretended not to see. Other times, it was worse. There were whispers of doubt, of judgment. Some men said scars like hers meant she had been careless, that she had not fought hard enough, that she had let something happen that could have been avoided, as if survival itself was a choice, as if being scarred was a weakness rather than proof of endurance. Their words cut deeper than blades, because they came from those who should have understood, from the very men who claimed to be her brothers. She learned quickly that silence was safer than confession. When she was injured, she wrapped her wounds alone. When pain kept her awake, she bit her lip until it bled rather than let them hear. When scars burned under fabric, she endured in silence. Because when brothers in arms looked away, they left her with no choice but to carry her truth alone. There was one night she would never forget. After a battle, exhausted and trembling, she sat near the fire, her jacket torn, her scars exposed. One man noticed, staring for a moment before turning away. Another shifted uncomfortably, then walked off. No one spoke. No one asked. No one offered comfort. In that silence, she felt colder than the night air. Surrounded by comrades, she had never felt more alone. And yet, she also understood something in that moment. Their looking away was not only betrayal, it was fear. They looked away because her scars reminded them of their own vulnerability. They looked away because they could not face what war did to women, to comrades, to those they claimed to protect. They looked away because to see her truth was to admit their failure, their complicity, their fragility. It was easier to pretend she was whole, to let the uniform hide what they could not bear to acknowledge. The women in the barracks understood better. They did not look away. When a scar was revealed, they met it with eyes steady, with hands gentle, with silence that held compassion rather than avoidance. They bore witness when brothers turned away. They carried each other's truths when the men would not. In that sisterhood, she found the solidarity she had been denied. Still, the loneliness lingered. The phrase "brothers in arms" became bitter on her tongue. She had fought beside them, but when it mattered most, she had stood alone. Her scars were not just marks of violence. They were marks of abandonment, reminders of the silence of men who could not or would not face her truth. Years later, long after the war, she sometimes met with former comrades. They spoke of battles, of victories, of medals. Rarely did they speak of scars, and when they saw hers, even then, they looked away. Time had not changed their fear, but she no longer needed their acknowledgement. She had learned to stand without their gaze, to speak without their permission, to carry her scars as truth, regardless of whether they could face it. Her brothers in arms had looked away, but she had never looked away from herself. She had faced the mirror, faced the whispers, faced the silence. And in the end, that courage mattered more than their avoidance. The uniform torn by fire. It happened so suddenly that she barely had time to understand what was being taken from her. One moment she was running, the chaos of battle exploding around her in smoke and thunder, and the next, a wall of fire leapt up where the sky should have been. The blast tore through the air, hot enough to strip oxygen from her lungs, fast enough to rip fabric from flesh. She fell to the ground, disoriented, choking on smoke, her ears ringing with the sound of shattering, and when she staggered up again, she realized the fire had done what she had spent years fighting against. It had torn her uniform apart. The sleeve of her jacket hung in ribbons, the chest was scorched and ripped open. Her trousers clung in patches, seared at the edges. Beneath the torn cloth, her scars blazed into the open, no longer hidden by seams or shadows. For the first time, the battlefield saw not the soldier she pretended to be, but the woman carved by pain beneath the fabric. Her body, the archive of her survival, stood exposed under the eyes of comrades and enemies alike. The moment froze. Around her the battle raged on, men shouting, weapons clashing, smoke swirling. Yet she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. The uniform had been her shield, her disguise, her last barrier between herself and a world unwilling to see the truth of what she carried. Now it lay in tatters, and the world could no longer look away. Some averted their eyes immediately, ashamed or afraid. Others stared too long, unable to mask their shock. She heard a laugh somewhere, nervous, sharp, the same kind of laughter that had once mocked her scars in training yards. But she also saw something else in the eyes of a few: recognition. A flicker of respect, not for her uniform, not for her rank, but for her survival. She stood taller than she thought she could. The fire still burned nearby, the heat searing, but she refused to cover herself with her arms. If the war wanted to expose her scars, then let it. If the uniform could no longer conceal the truth, then the truth would stand unhidden. She lifted her chin, gripped her weapon tighter, and moved forward. She would not allow flames to strip her dignity along with her fabric. Later, when the battle quieted and the smoke cleared, she looked down at the remains of her uniform. The fabric was blackened, brittle, crumbling at the touch. She traced the burns on her skin, new wounds added to the old. The scars that had once been secret now mingled with the fresh marks of fire. Her body, once again, had become the battlefield. But this time she did not weep at the exposure. She felt a strange kind of release. The fire had betrayed her secret, but it had also freed her from hiding. She no longer needed to pretend that she was untouched beneath the uniform. The world had seen, and she was still standing. The shame that once weighed her down began to shift into something else: defiance. She realized that the uniform had always been a mask, but the scars were the truth. And truth, even exposed unwillingly, could not be taken from her. In the barracks that night, the women gathered around her. They did not speak of the battle, did not ask about the fire. They simply touched her gently, their hands on her burned sleeve, on the edges of scars that now stood uncovered. "You are still here," one whispered. Another added, "The flames showed them what we already knew." They did not see her exposure as shame. They saw it as revelation. She slept in torn fabric, her body aching, her skin raw, but her heart strangely lighter. The fear of being seen had haunted her for years, and now that it had happened, she discovered something unexpected. Survival did not diminish under exposure. It grew stronger. Her scars were no longer hidden, no longer secret, no longer confined to whispers. They were visible, undeniable, unerasable. The uniform torn by fire had given her something she had never chosen, but had always needed: the chance to exist without disguise. And though she would wear repaired fabric again, though she would cover herself in seams once more, she would never forget that moment when the flames tore the mask away and left her standing, scarred and unbroken, for the world to see. The memory of cruel hands never left her. They haunted her in sleep, flaring in nightmares that left her gasping in the dark. But the memory of gentle hands began to rise beside them, softer but steady, offering balance. For every mark of cruelty, there was at least one trace of kindness, and that mattered. Years later, long after the war, When she allowed someone to touch her scars with love, she did not flinch. She had been prepared by those earlier moments, those rare hands that traced her wounds without fear. She had learned that not all touches were violence, that some could be healing, that her scars did not make her less deserving of tenderness. She carried that lesson into peace, into family, into the future. The hands that traced her wounds did not erase the past. They did something greater. They taught her that scars, when met with compassion, could become bridges instead of barriers. They could connect rather than isolate. They could carry memory without carrying shame. Her scars remained. The uniform still pressed against them. But now, when she felt them burn, she remembered the hands that once touched them softly and reminded her of her humanity. And that memory was enough to keep her standing. Her scars as her anthem. There came a day when she stopped wishing her scars away. It did not happen suddenly, nor did it come from a single revelation. It happened slowly, after years of silence and shame, after nights of hiding and days of pretending. One morning, as she dressed in her uniform, she caught her reflection in a piece of cracked glass, and instead of flinching, she paused. For the first time, she saw her scars not as disfigurements, but as declarations. They were not whispers of shame. They were anthems of survival. Her scars had always spoken, though she had tried not to listen. They spoke of nights when she had endured what no one should endure. They spoke of battles fought in shadows, of strength summoned in silence, of mornings where she rose when everything within her wanted to stay down. Each line, each ridge, each faded mark was a verse in a song that belonged to her alone. And together, they created an anthem louder than any drumbeat or battle cry. At first, she carried that anthem quietly, humming it only to herself. She traced the scars with her fingers at night, whispering the stories they held. She began to realize that these marks did not make her weak. They made her honest. They were the map of her truth, a truth that could not be erased no matter how tightly the uniform fit. Slowly, she began to walk differently. Her shoulders squared not only in discipline, but in pride. Her steps carried not only obedience, but defiance. The anthem of her scars played silently within her, but it changed the way she moved through the world. Others began to notice. They could not always name what was different, but they felt it. She was no longer hiding. When her sleeve slipped, she did not tug it up quickly. When her collar loosened, she did not pull it tight again. She let glimpses of her scars show, and though whispers still rose, she no longer bowed beneath them. She let the world see pieces of her truth, and in doing so, she reclaimed it. For the women in the barracks, her quiet defiance became a kind of anthem too. When they saw her scars revealed without shame, they felt courage stir within themselves. Slowly, others began to loosen their collars, to let sleeves fall, to share the truth written on their bodies. They began to hum the anthem together, not in unison but in harmony, each scar adding its own voice. Their scars did not make them the same. They made them connected. And connection was a kind of music. Even the men, some of them, began to change. At first they still looked away, still struggled to face what had been hidden. But when she no longer hid, when she stood openly scarred yet unbroken, they were forced to see her. A few began to understand, even if they could not fully grasp the depth. They saw that courage was not only in the medals pinned on chests or the victories claimed in battle. Courage was in the skin that bore scars without flinching, in the anthem that rose from survival itself. Years passed, and the war ended, but her anthem did not fade. In peace, it grew louder. When she walked through towns, strangers sometimes stared. Children sometimes asked questions. She did not silence them. She spoke gently, honestly telling them that scars meant survival, that scars meant stories, that scars meant strength. Her anthem became not just hers, but something she offered to the world. She carried her scars not as burdens, but as banners. One day, She stood before a group of young women, uniforms crisp and new, their faces still untouched by battle. She pulled back her sleeve and let them see the scars that lined her arm. She did not apologize, did not explain in detail. She simply said, "These are mine. They are the proof that you can endure more than you think. They are not shame. They are song." The women stared in silence, some with tears in their eyes. In that moment, her anthem became theirs too. Her scars were not erased by time, nor softened completely by healing. They remained etched into her skin, reminders that the past was real. But she no longer wished them gone. They were her anthem, her testimony, her identity. They were the sound of defiance against silence, the music of survival, louder than the laughter of those who once mocked her, stronger than the medals that once burned against her skin. The uniform had never been able to hide her scars, and now she no longer wanted it to. She wore them openly, proudly, as the anthem of a woman who had endured the unendurable and lived to sing it. The uniform couldn't hide her scars. In the end, when the war had finally burned itself out, when the smoke cleared and the uniforms were folded away, she stood before her reflection one last time in the fabric that had once been her armor. The uniform was faded, the seams frayed, the patches stained by earth and blood and time. It no longer carried the sharp lines of authority, nor the crisp illusion of perfection. It sagged against her body, as though exhausted too. And yet, even in its wear, it carried the same truth it always had. It could never hide what lived beneath. She unbuttoned it slowly, her fingers deliberate, not with shame but with reverence. Layer by layer, the uniform fell away, revealing the body it had tried to cover. The scars were all there, ridges across her arms, burns along her shoulders, marks etched deep into her thighs. Some were pale, nearly invisible now. Others remained raw, as though time refused to soften them. Together, they formed a tapestry of survival, a story written not in ink, but in flesh. Once she had feared their revelation. Once she had believed that to be seen scarred was to be diminished, to be mocked, to be dismissed. But now, she saw differently. She saw that her scars were not the opposite of strength. They were strength itself. They were the proof that she had walked through fire and had not been consumed, that she had been broken and had not vanished, that she had been treated as less and had become more. The uniform had given her protection, but it had also demanded silence. It had allowed her to stand among others, but it had asked her to hide her truth. And now, as she folded it for the last time, she realized she no longer needed its disguise. She no longer needed to pretend. She was not just a soldier. She was not just a survivor. She was a woman whose body carried memory, whose scars carried testimony, whose life carried meaning beyond medals, beyond ranks, beyond war. She stepped outside into the dawn. The air was cool, the sky painted with the fragile colors of peace. For the first time in years, she felt the sun on her skin without fabric between them. It warmed the scars, touched them gently, as if blessing them. She lifted her face to the light and let it wash over her. She was not hiding anymore. The people who saw her did not see only a soldier. They saw her scars, and in them they saw endurance. Children asked questions, elders nodded in silence. Some looked away still, but she no longer cared. Their gaze could not take from her what she had already claimed. Her scars were not for their judgment, they were for her truth. In time, she began to speak of them openly. She told her story to those who would listen, not in detail that reopened wounds, but in words that turned scars into lessons. She told young women that scars are not signs of weakness, but of battles survived. She told young men that strength is not in hiding pain, but in carrying it honestly. She told children that the body remembers. But remembering is not the same as being broken. Her scars became her anthem, her teaching, her legacy. When she was older, Long after the uniform had been set aside forever, she kept it folded in a chest. Sometimes she opened it, touching the fabric with fingers softer now, remembering the weight it once carried. She no longer hated it. She no longer saw it as her prison. She saw it as a companion. Flawed, imperfect, but faithful. It had never been able to hide her scars, but perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps its purpose had been simply to carry her until she was ready to carry herself. And now she could. Her scars remained with her until the end. They did not fade into nothingness. They remained as living lines, as reminders of what she had endured, as proof of who she had become. When others asked her if she wished them gone, she shook her head. "No," she would say. "They are not ugly. They are not shame. They are the map of my survival. They are the truth the uniform could never hide." And so her story closed not in silence, but in light, not in hiding, but in revelation, not in erasure, but in endurance. She had lived scarred, yes, but unbroken. She had carried the weight of a uniform and the weight of silence, and she had emerged with something far greater than either, the strength to let her scars speak for themselves. The uniform could not hide her scars, and she would never again ask it to.